Speculation about a hostage and ceasefire deal for Gaza intensifies. There's a harrowing report detailing what one Israeli newspaper calls arbitrary killings and rampant lawlessness in Gaza. And we'll have an interview with a foremost historian about Israel, Syria and the world beyond. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. It's Unholy Two Jews on the news. Good afternoon to those who had a good night's sleep, to those who were awakened by sirens due to a ballistic missile from Yemen at 2:40 a.m. Good evening to you. I mean, that was quite a wake-up call for the central part of Israel tonight, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, that is really in the dead middle of the night, and I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but people with young children having to get sleeping kids down or across into a sealed room, safe room. Really, I mean, an ordeal.
Yeah, it was quite a surprise, and I have to tell you, I was thinking about this in the 2 hours I couldn't sleep after the siren. That it's been a year and 2 months, and definitely for a long period in that year and 2 months, we have felt the war in many ways. Obviously, the first months, there were rockets from Hamas and Hezbollah all through the year. Everyone knew someone who was fighting in Gaza or fighting in Lebanon. There were attacks from Iran. In recent weeks, I mean, besides the fact that Israelis are walking with a heavy heart because of the hostages, at least in central Israel, I'm not talking about the north and the south where people are slowly trying to get their life back to normal. In central Israel, you felt the war less, right? I mean, Nasrallah is dead, Sinwar is dead, Iran is somewhat deterred, Bashar al-Assad is gone, and you felt it less. But now with that, 2:40 a.m. Ballistic missile from Yemen, it was a reminder that this is really far from over.
Yeah, and what are people saying is the sort of message it was sending? Because obviously we've been saying, and lots of people have been saying in the last weeks, that Iran and its ring of fire strategy surrounding Israel by proxies, whether Hezbollah, Hamas, or the Houthis, is on the back foot. It's reeling. My first take on this, besides feeling sympathy for you being woken up in the middle of the night, was, well, there's Iran saying, look, we haven't gone away, and we still have, as it were, a sort of metaphorical, knife at your throat, and we can still hurt you. And that's how I took it. But how are people reading?
Right, that is exactly the message. The message is we can still hurt you, even if you think that the axis has been weakened, and it has been. But we still have the ability to do this. And obviously, it's one ballistic missile. It was intercepted, but it still causes this. The central Israel to wake up and realize that this is still a thing that needs to be solved, even if some parts of the other different fronts Israel is fighting with are at least weakened. By the way, I should tell you, I have a close friend in New York who, after visiting Israel, kept her alerts of the Israeli home front. So she's always the first one to write me. When something happens, she says, are you okay? If anyone wants to feel like what Israelis feel, I think just keep your home front command of the IDF on your phone, and you could get those alerts and kind of feel like what Israelis are feeling at the dead of night on a idle night between Wednesday and Thursday.
So, that is in a way a context and a reminder that this is a state of war that's going on. There had been talk, pretty excited talk a few days ago, I don't know where we're at exactly at this moment, that there might be some kind of respite in the form of a deal, a ceasefire that would bring at least some of the hostages back. It was going to be in phases. There was, people look at the kind of Kremlinology of this, the body language suggesting there were signs it was more serious, whether it was Bill Burns, head of the CIA, getting involved directly. He's obviously been involved before, but, that's significant. And even there was talk of Netanyahu himself going to some kind of, stage or meeting that suggested, okay, something's afoot. But I don't know where exactly at this hour. We're talking middle of the day on Thursday, where the sort of anticipation is at.
So first of all, what we know, and it's not a lot, is that Hamas, again, according to what Israel is reading and what the mediating countries are saying, Hamas is now willing to give up its main demand, which was to say that the war is over and a withdrawal of all Israeli troops before the first stage of the hostage deal begins. So we should remind our listeners, there are always, ever since this framework was presented by President Biden, essentially basing his framework on what Netanyahu was agreeing to in May. Things changed since, but the framework was talking about two main stages. The first stage is a release of the humanitarian cases, although one could say that by now, after 440 days, all the cases are humanitarian cases, but this means mainly the women and the elderly. And then Hamas would demand the end of the war and the withdrawal of troops, and the second phase, which is the young men and the soldiers. So, first of all, as I said, Hamas, there are signs that will agree to not declare to not declare the end of the war before the first stage, and also Israel showing some flexibility vis-a-vis the Netzarim corridor and the Philadelphia corridor. And also, we should say, a lot has changed on the ground, right? You have Trump threatening there will be hell to pay if the hostages are not released before I am inaugurated. You have, we talked about this a lot, the Shiite access weakened because of Israel's actions against Iran, against Hezbollah, the proxy of Iran, and of course Bashar al-Assad being that final part of that wall that has been weakened. Sinwar is dead. So there are reasons that Hamas would want to go for this deal at this point that we are at. It's interesting to me because I think there are two messages being sent, and they're of course contradictory because it is the Middle East. So I would say that Netanyahu is saying to his far-right coalition, particularly to people like Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, wink, wink, I don't intend to go forward after the first phase of the deal. We're not going to end the war, but let's get some of the hostages out. And on the other end, you have the mediating countries saying to Hamas, again, wink, wink, the minute Netanyahu starts this deal, he won't be able to pull back because there's a pressure of the Israeli society on him to bring back. All of the hostages will be so concentrated, we should say. The latest polls in Israel say that 72% of the Israeli society is willing to end the war so you can bring back the hostages. That is the highest number since the beginning of the war. And Netanyahu sees this too. I mean, at the end of the day, if there is a moment to do this deal, that moment is now.
I mean, it's so often, isn't it, in Israel, but also in the wider Middle East, where the message is, trust me, I don't mean it. Trust me, I'm lying. It's so often the way. I think on that point you made about the calculus for Netanyahu, that he could do the first phase and wink, wink, the question would then have to be asked, why on earth didn't you agree to this 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 9 months ago? If, as a lot of people were saying, the option is there to agree and then do something else later, then get them as many as you can home and then deal with that, cross that bridge when it comes to it, kind of thing. On your point about Trump,
well, you have to have Hamas flexibility as well in this category.
Sure, but if they were ready to, in a way, whatever you needed to say to get the people back, say it, and then deal with the consequences afterwards. That was the logic of that position, of people saying, we're talking about hostages, we're talking about people who need to be brought home, do it, and then deal with afterwards, not necessarily what the other side agree with. Just on the couple of other things, the Trump message of, there'll be hell to pay. I wonder what people think he would actually do. I mean, this is also the president who says, I want to end wars, not start them. And so it's interesting because it obviously has had some leverage, some force, this notion that, you better sort this out before January the 20th. And yet I think it's an open question what actually he would do. But the calculus I wanted to get onto, because you explained why Hamas's calculus will have changed, because they've lost Sinwar, they're a big patron. Iran is absolutely reeling with the loss of one of its other clients in the form of Assad and Hezbollah. But on the Israeli side, for a long time, I think some listeners might be confused because we were often saying on the podcast, look, there's not going to be a deal at the various stages over the last year because Netanyahu doesn't want one, because a deal would mean, in effect, the end of the war. The end of the war would mean elections. And he would fear that's the end for him. And then he would have to face the music of what we were talking about last week on the podcast, these various criminal cases, corruption cases against him. So that's been the sort of logic that's held. You might ask, what's changed? I would say that logic no longer holds, because given the series of military successes he's had, military and geopolitical successes, the most obvious being the fall of Assad, he can now be the kind of victor. He's got that photograph of him now visiting Mount Hermon as if the all-conquering hero. And therefore the notion that was seen before, I always thought actually wrongly, but axiomatic, that any election he'll lose, my fear that he's going to be prime minister till he's 90. I think now even people who were previously skeptical about that could now see that if he were to go into elections as the guy who got rid of Sinwar, Nasrallah, Assad, and therefore has weakened the ultimate enemy, Iran, that's an election-winning platform for him, and therefore suddenly doing a deal, getting the hostages home, and even ending the war is not so scary for him personally.
Well, you asked the question and answered it, so I like that technology. But I will add to that, look, there's another sort of part of this puzzle, and that is the Saudi normalization, because there have been reports also that there's a bigger deal in play for Netanyahu, right, saying agreeing to the end of the war, bringing back the hostages, and receiving something like a Saudi normalization. There are also, Israeli analysts always like to take everything like 5 steps forward and say, so if Netanyahu wants to go to an election, he would do that on the Saudi deal, and then essentially it would be easier for him. Netanyahu is always the one to delay and to have all the balls in the air, so I don't know if that is, again, the reasoning, but as you say, he is stronger than he was, and if there is a moment to do this deal, that moment is now. I'll just say that, first of all, interestingly, there is this tragic and silent rift breaking inside the hostages' families, because now what you have is this, if there's one stage, you're going to have a lot of people left behind, the young men and the soldiers. And there are people who are saying, wait a minute, but we want a comprehensive deal. We want all of them back. And that is a very painful thing that is going on, again, quietly, because these families have all been working together throughout these 14 months. But, there's something that stayed with me. Sharon Cunyo, who was abducted with her 2 daughters, Emma and Yuli, her husband is still there, their father. They're 4 years old. And she talked in the studio this week, and she told me that they keep asking about him, but this week, and this broke my heart, this week one of her daughters said, Daddy doesn't love me anymore, because if he did love me, he would come back. And just to think of the pain of these families and to see the fact that there might be a deal and again their loved ones are left behind, that is something that you cannot, the pain of this is something that we cannot imagine.
Yeah, and a function of how long this has gone on. That a hostage crisis, your point about a rift within the families, I mean, that's the sort of thing. People can hold it together only so long. And as you said, this kind of phase deal means there's going to be a divergence of interest. Let's just say something about the coalition politics and also the return of what used to dominate our attention until 14 or 15 months ago, namely the judicial coup, as the critics call it, judicial overhaul, as its advocates call it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is an official return to it. Justice Minister Yariv Levin announced this on social media this time. It was not a press conference like he did it the first time, 4th of January 2023. But it is clear that the coalition is returning to it. They feel emboldened by what has been going on and the strength of the leader. 2 main things that are on the agenda. But there's, of course, much more, and we talked about this in recent episodes. 2 main things. One is to change the makeup of the commission that appoints judges. This is what Yariv Levin wanted and wants to do. That means that he has the power to decide on the Supreme Court justices and, of course, the rest of the judges in the different circuits in the Israel judicial system, but also the attempt of this coalition to fire the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara. She was always considered by this coalition as something of a thorn in their side. She is the head of the prosecution in this country and also an advisor to the government. Everyone has a skin in the game in this complicated chess board, because Netanyahu himself is standing trial. So to try and fire the attorney general is quite complicated. It yells, it screams conflict of interest. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is pushing for this as ferociously as he can, we should say there are petitions to fire him at the High Court submitted to the High Court of Justice, because I will remind you, he squeaked by as becoming minister, head of the police. He made a commitment. He testified that he would not interfere in police investigations. How shall we say this gently? All evidence to the contrary of what he is trying to do. So he is worried that the Attorney General will not stand up and defend him at the High Court of Justice. He's right about that, I would say. And he's concerned that they might fire him. So everyone is in the mix of this. And we'll add to that a lot of other bills that the coalition is bringing forth. We talked about the war against the media, against the academia. And the trick they're using this time, we should say, is that they're having actually private MKs presenting the bill and not the government itself presenting these bills, so you could cut through a lot of red tape and you don't have to go through the Ministry of Justice. All of this is brewing while a war is still going on, hostages are being held. All of this, she'll remind you of the missiles from Yemen again, but all of this is happening at the very same time.
And that itself is not a coincidence, because when the government was on the back foot because the country was in trauma and in shock after October 7th, one of the first things they had to do was to say, okay, we're putting on ice the judicial program, the judicial coup, because we realised we absolutely, our political support is hanging by a thread. Now they're more confident. Because they are masters of all they survey, with, again, Lebanon and Syria and the weakness of Iran.
And the coalition added numbers because Gideon Sa'ar is now part of it, so it's stronger than it was.
But Netanyahu's position politically is, I would say, stronger now than it's been at any time since October 7, 2023. Therefore, he thinks the space to return to what anybody else would have thought was previously, self-sabotage. It would have been before, but now there's the space, and they are, your mention of Ben Gvir, your mention of Netanyahu's corruption trials, it reminds you of why this is so important to them. They need the Supreme Court out of their way. It is a thorn in their side more than. And you've obviously got those ultra-Orthodox parties as well who are very happy to see an eviscerated Supreme Court, because it's that body that will insist one way or another on their young men going into the military and doing military service, and they do not want that, as we've heard. So that is right back and back on the agenda.
Yeah, and the code name to this is a return to October 6th. That's how it's dubbed in Israeli society, as in the coalition doesn't care that a rift that was created before October 7th is one of the reasons that Israel fell to its enemies weak and thus attacked. I'll just quote you one painful tweet by Eyal Eshel, who's the father of Roni Eshel. She's a soldier who died at Nachal Oz base on October 7th. And he wrote, "If we're returning to October 6th, can I please have my daughter back?" So that is the feeling of many Israelis. I think it's important to point out, we talk a lot about Ben Gvir and a lot about Smotrich. They make up 10% of the electorate. Because of the way this coalition is constructed, they have a disproportionate power over a prime minister that wants his coalition to survive. They do not represent the main, the mainstream Israeli. I think that's important to say as we talk about this Israeli coalition.
Yeah, it's been one of the deformations of this coalition that this tail, this ultra-nationalist tail, has been wagging the Israeli governmental dog for the whole, ever since the day it was formed. And that's one of the reasons why people are so angry, I think, with Netanyahu for bringing them in. I mean, bringing them into the Knesset by clubbing them together, but also into his coalition.
In the meantime, the war in Gaza has been going on for 440 days. A story in Haaretz by Yaniv Kubovich talks about the fact that the Netzarim corridor, that is the sort of 7 kilometers separating essentially the northern part of the Gaza Strip from the southern part, talking about the lawlessness in that area, bringing testimony from soldiers, talking about the fact that whoever is crossing the Netzarim corridor gets shot. This is a harrowing story. We've had Ehud Barak, former prime minister, on the podcast a few weeks ago. He quoted Ben Gurion over and over saying that Israel needs short wars. This war has been going on for more than 14 months. The troops on the ground, they are exhausted. The discipline is, shaky. And it shows in some of these cases and some of these testimonies that are brought forth in Haaretz.
Yeah, it's a very, very disturbing read. I think people will struggle with it. The headline, "No civilians, everyone's a terrorist. IDF soldiers expose arbitrary killings and rampant lawlessness in Gaza's Netzarim corridor." The sources for the stories are soldiers and particularly commanders on the ground. So the reporter has spoken to IDF commanders who describe this sort of shifting line. One of the issues that the report uncovers is that it's not very clearly demarcated, this zone into which anyone who sets foot is branded by the military as a terrorist and therefore a legitimate target. It varies from day to day. It varies from commander to commander, hence this notion of it being arbitrary. Another commander saying, was a senior reserve commander, tells Aretz, it means ignoring that for over a year we've operated in a lawless space where human life holds no value. Yes, we commanders and combatants are part of participating in the atrocity unfolding in Gaza, and everyone must face this reality. It's really full on, episodes in which people who are clearly unarmed were nevertheless targeted, in one case waving a white flag, and the deputy commander says, I don't know what a white flag is, shoot to kill. I mean, all of this would be, pretty compelling evidence if people wanted to bring charges against these people. And I think that will be one reason why a lot of our listeners will feel very uncomfortable at Haaretz publicising this. They'll be saying, what you're doing, the work of Israel's enemies for them. And, this is you're washing our dirty linen in public. I always, at that note, at that sentiment, remember the words of the very brilliant Jewish columnist Chaim Berman, who used to say, those who don't wash their dirty linen in public don't wash it at all, meaning you have to air these things publicly. I think it sort of confirms, you mentioned Ehud Barak, who we had on the podcast. I think Amos Harel, a friend of the podcast and defense analyst for Haaretz, did say and has written that there is a real fear that discipline has broken down in parts of the IDF in Gaza. And that's partly related to this empowering of commanders at a much lower level on the ground than would have happened in previous conflicts. That the old rules of engagement and restraint that were put in place, that we've talked about before, the real deliberation and sort of processes that went on before an airstrike was called in. This report talks about a flash procedure, which was meant to be reserved only for very, very emergency situations. If you were trying to, there'd been an ambush and you were trying to get people out and they were under fire. Now that flash procedure, in which you're allowed to sort of bypass the usual rules to call in a drone strike or airstrike, is being used all the time. And people on the ground are being empowered to make decisions that in the past they couldn't have made or shouldn't have made, and that's happening. I would just say this. I think there'll be plenty of people hearing this who will be, for reasons I really do understand, hoping they don't have to deal with this. They'll be looking almost instinctively for the bit in it which means they can sort of put it out of their mind. And the usual mechanism for that is to question the source of it. And so you say, well, this horrible report, it's Human Rights Watch, we know they're anti-Israel. Or it's Amnesty, we know they're anti-Israel. This is Israeli soldiers talking to an Israeli reporter for an Israeli newspaper. I know people have, mixed feelings about Haaretz, but they are authentically part of the Israeli press, and seems to me a detailed piece of work. We have to sort of face the consequences of it, even though this is not easy, as one of those commanders says. This is the reality, and it's very clear those commanders want other people to be aware of the situation they're in. They are sort of sounding the alarm, and I think we do have an obligation really to listen.
I'm not defending any of this, but I think it's important to keep in the background the fact that Israel is fighting a very long war. These soldiers are, their nerves are racked. This enemy is the cruelest possible. It only wants its civilians to be killed. While it's interesting, the IDF is, for a very long time trying to not hurt civilians. But I agree that this is something that should be looked at as clearly and as soberly as possible. I think, again, what is happening here, not only is this war prolonged, the soldiers on the ground fighting this incredibly long war. I think what's interesting here is that it shows, in a sense, what happened to the Israeli military since October 7th. Obviously, Israel is traumatized by the biggest massacre against its civilians. The military is traumatized. And the military needs discipline, it needs hierarchy. But if you're a commander on the ground, if you're a soldier on the ground, and you look at the top brass of the military, and you say to yourself, these people, right, the head of the IDF Chief of Staff, the head of the Southern Command, the head of the operational branch of the IDF, these people are still in place. They're good people, they're morally sound, but they are still in their position since the biggest failure in Israel's history. And this is not something that's discussed in Israeli society, but when you think of a soldier on the ground saying, am I going to take orders from these people who should have resigned a long time ago? There are all sorts of reasons why they haven't. They all said they'll take responsibility and they'll resign when the war is over. But I think that, in a way, has a corrosive effect on what is happening on the ground. That's just what I would point out. I think it's also, as we go into this detailed report, I think it's also important this week to mention the report by Andrew Fox and the Henry Jackson Society analyzing the death toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health and the sort of manipulation of fatalities. We're not saying there aren't a lot of innocent people dying in Gaza, and that is a huge tragedy. But what they're showing in this report, not only that the media in general is taking the Hamas-run health ministry stats as facts, but also how it's manipulated in many ways to show that there are more civilians than there are combatants. You have the example of the 22-year-old who was written as a 4-year-old boy, or a 31-year-old who was written in the sort of list of the deceased as a 1-year-old baby. It's very clear. If we were talking about a 50% ratio, it's a different between civilians and combatants. It's different than saying there's 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. This is very morbid. That's a very morbid conversation. I'm sorry that we're even in it, but I would recommend also to read this report, which has obviously got less attention because it doesn't fit the narrative, but of the international media. I think it is important to look at that. Again, not saying at all that this is not very large numbers and a huge tragedy. I think we both can agree on that.
We can. I mean, yes, I would say Henry Jackson Society to me is a less credible source than Haaretz, but again, people will have their own views on that. I know the piece of what you're referring to. Just on the point about reducing civilian numbers,
where's
I think
the Hamas Ministry of Health rank on your
on
your credibility list. Just wondering about that.
I don't think you need to wonder. That's in a very, very different place. Okay. I think the point about minimizing civilian casualties, the reason why this report is so hard to take is that there are direct cases cited by Israeli IDF commanders where the people in front of them are obviously unarmed civilians, and nevertheless they are targeted. So that idea of we're going out of our way to prevent civilian harm, that's why this is so hard to take. I was just going to say...
by the way, I think the UN as well, I think we talked about this a few months ago, amended its ratio of civilians and combatants. It's not only this report, but sure.
One of the things we're going to talk about with our guest when we come to speak to him is what all of this does for Israel's standing internationally. And so I just put that as a balancing point to what we were saying earlier about this string of military victories, and they are real and they've happened, Hezbollah and the weakening of Iran and so on. In the last year, that has definitely happened, but also what's happened is an erosion of Israel's standing internationally, and we've seen it with those ICC warrants. And stories like this are not just the fact that the story exists, but the evidence in it goes to damaging that. So that you have to put that in the scales alongside the military victories. Where is Israel standing now? Is it now weaker than it was? And stories like this, or actions like this that are reported, do add to that sense of increasing international isolation, I think. Some grim news out of Canada this week. A synagogue in a suburb of Montreal was targeted in what police suspect was an arson attack. It comes after a really devastating attack in Melbourne, where the Adas Yisrael synagogue was attacked as well in a really devastating fire that has been branded. It took a while, by the way, in Sydney for the authorities to say it was a terror attack or suspected terror attack with anti-Semitism as the motive. But we've had now, enough of these for us to draw some conclusions from Canada all the way to Australia, a long way from the Middle East. And yet, inevitably, people are sort of tying these things together. I just want to say about that. I mean, the motive, we don't yet know. No one has yet been sort of tried or convicted for these things. It could be that this was just old-fashioned hatred of Jews. Anti-Semites attack synagogues. That's what they do. It could be that the motive in the minds of the people doing this was related to Israel-Gaza. It doesn't actually matter because it does, but it doesn't limit or mitigate the crime itself, because either way, the consequences are the same, which is an attack on Jews and Jewish life and on a synagogue. Because I think often people get themselves wrapped up is, if it's motivated by Israel and Palestine and Gaza, does it count as anti-Semitic? Answer, yes, if you're attacking Jews at prayer in a synagogue, a house of worship. I think just very, very sobering that these things have happened, and inevitably they're going to draw in all these conversations that are very difficult to have.
I mean, look, there are 16,000 kilometers separating Montreal and Melbourne. It's the same hate in both cases. You mentioned the Montreal synagogue, decry. By the way, it's the second time it was firebombed since October 7th. The first time happened a few weeks after. The Melbourne story is really shocking because the synagogue itself sort of burned down. Like, the building still stands, but everything inside has been burned. I think a congregant was also suffered injuries. Among the charred ruins, by the way, a Torah scroll was pulled out, and that same Torah scroll was actually brought from Europe after World War II, because the synagogue then was of course decimated. I mean, Melbourne is a city of 53,000 Jews out of a population of more than 5 million. It is the largest community in Australia. I know all this because a good friend of mine lives there, a good friend from the age of 16. If you ever need any embarrassing information about me, she's the person to go to. But she's been describing to me the fact that every weekend there have been pro-Palestinian protests in Melbourne, in Sydney, since October 7th. This has reached Australia as well. This is a terrible, terrible incident, both this and Montreal. I mean, as you say, it doesn't really matter what the motive is. You are targeting Jews, and that this has to be, I think the answer to this, the response has to be very fierce. Something has to deter. It can't be only beefing up the security in these synagogues and Jewish institutions. There has to be, an answer. I think in Montreal there's a lot of claim against the mayor that isn't, strong enough against the anti-Semitism. The point is, you have to have a very fierce answer, and I think decisions to be made against this phenomena. It's not dying down. It is still 14 months after the war, and it's still continuing. Yeah,
and it busts the myth, I think, that some people, including in Israel, have, that the outside world will somehow be safer and that there is security to be found. Some of the people who have been speaking about the synagogue attack in Melbourne are Israelis. Israeli expats, people who've left Israel, they said that part of the thinking was they would go to somewhere where it would just be quiet, the other side of the world from the conflict. They could drop off their kids to a Jewish school and think it's just going to be fine, and then it isn't. And it's that sense that there's nowhere safe, and that and you can't really escape this conflict. The thing that's really hard to sort of unpack and unbundle is, on the one hand, it's anti-Semitic. The people who are going to that synagogue have nothing to do with what's going on in Israel or Gaza. They are separate. On the other, at the same time, this is why it's hard to untangle, we know from all the groups that monitor anti-Jewish hate that attacks on Jews spike whenever the conflict in the Middle East gets hotter. It happened in 2014, it happened in 2021, it happened in 2009, and it's absolutely happened since October the 7th. That you see, and it's happened here in Britain, this huge spike in attacks on Jews. So the Jews are not responsible for what happens in Israel and the Middle East, but they do feel the impact of what happens in Israel and the Middle East, and they are connected to it because in some ways of the people who do this. I think that what flows from that are lessons for both sides, actually, in a way, of this global pitched conflict about this. It means if you are in the anti-Israel sort of Palestinian solidarity movement, there has to be an understanding that if you are dialing up the sort of heat and rhetoric about this conflict in a very intense way, it won't stay in the Middle East. There will be communities in the places you are that will be affected by it. Your neighbours, your fellow citizens will be affected. It's not a foreign issue in that way. And then similarly, and I've said this on the podcast before, but for Israel too, that the actions Israel takes do have consequences for diaspora Jews. I know that doesn't factor in anybody's thinking, and policymakers don't think about that, but it's a real thing, and you can see it in Montreal and in Melbourne. And you have to walk that line. You're not saying, therefore, you blame the Israeli government. Not at all. These are anti-Semites who've done this. They're attacking this. They're attacking synagogues. But when the conflict is hot and it's like this, the consequences are felt around the world.
I wonder if it's not to be said that certain people are always looking for reasons to attack Jews, and this is giving them a good reason. But it doesn't mean that there was... to put it simplistically, anti-Semitism did exist before the creation of the State of Israel.
It absolutely did, but the figures are the figures. They do. The attacks on Jews increased by 500% in Britain after October 7th.
Israel is to blame for, or is it something that people are searching for a reason and they have it? But we shall move on because there is two interesting stories this week coming from our region. And to be honest, we actually found someone who could relate to both of them. And I think that we want to talk about not only the continuing fallout from the what is happening in Syria and the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, but also the decision by the Israeli government to sever diplomatic ties with Ireland. So let's find the perfect guest to talk about both those things.
Simon Sebag Montefiore is one of Britain's best-selling and most acclaimed historians, the author of biographies of young Stalin and the Romanov dynasty, as well as a new history of the world through some of its most eminent families. One of his books is a fixture on many, many Jewish shelves, namely Jerusalem, a biography. In fact, there is now an updated and revised edition of that book. He has written widely on the Middle East, with a long essay on Syria in the Times just this last week. He's also written about Ireland. There's no limit to this man's range. Simon Sebag Montefiore, welcome to Unholy.
Great to be back with you both.
So, like I said, you've written on a whole lot of Middle East related stuff, and we're going to get onto Syria in a moment. But I wanted to start with Ireland, because there was this decision by Israel this week to cut diplomatic ties with Ireland, to close down the Israeli embassy in Dublin. It turns out there's quite a long story to Jews and Ireland, and in your case, it's quite personal, this story. So just in a nutshell, tell us what that history is and how your family fits into it.
Well, when I was growing up, my family used to talk a lot about their Irishness, and they were very proud of their Irish connection. But at the same time, there was a shadow over it, because in 1904, when they arrived as Lithuanian Jewish refugees from the pogroms in Ireland, they settled in Limerick. And in Limerick, there was a notorious incident, the Limerick pogrom, in which they were attacked by a crowd and driven out of their homes.
And this is not a hugely long time ago, relatively.
It was not a hugely long time ago, and it's surprising because it's in the British Isles. At the same time, the Irish relationship with Jews has to be looked at in a nuanced way, because there were also, at almost the same time, there were Lord Mayors of Belfast and Dublin elected. There was the famous Briscoe father and son team, who were Lord Mayors of Dublin, who were Jewish and big supporters of the Israeli state.
So this is 1904, this pogrom.
But this was in 1904, this pogrom, and this week I simply retold that old story. I wrote about it 25 years ago, and I just simply mentioned it again with a somewhat explosive reaction. and really, all I would say about it is, there's a very small Jewish community in Ireland. This is a small incident from long ago that involved my family, but it does reflect an interesting Jewish history in Ireland, whereby a small group of Irish Jews have flourished there. My own family loved their Irishness, and I love my Irish connection as well. But equally, the attack in 1904 reflected a strain of Irish nationalism in the Sinn Féin party, personified by Arthur Griffith, that you would call blood and soil nationalism, and that strain goes through Irish history, and you see it again, for example, in the career of Francis Stewart, the novelist who I interviewed in the 90s, who was honoured as late as the year 2000 by the entire Irish literary establishment, but who really was a Nazi collaborator who broadcast from Berlin during World War II, and to me came out with a sort of slurry of anti-Semitic reflections. 1945, after Hitler's suicide, the Irish Prime Minister de Valera went to the German legation to pay condolences and to offer condolences for Hitler's death to the German Republic, which still is an astonishing thing to do, and still an indefensible thing to do.
Why is it so prevalent in Ireland, of all places?
I think something changed after October 7th, and I mean there is this strain, and it doesn't involve most Irish people. But James Joyce wrote about it. If you read Ulysses, James Joyce was in fact a supporter of Jewish self-determination. You can read in Ulysses, he's very sympathetic to the idea of Zionism, and he also hates the strain of anti-Semitism that is part of Irish nationalism. And he quotes the character of Mr. Dreesy, who comes out with the most appalling anti-Jewish diatribes. So Joyce himself wrote about this. It's not something that it's not only Jewish people that are talking about it.
And just on the business of an embassy closing, I mean, there's been a debate since this decision with people who are not sympathetic to the Irish government saying this is a bad idea for Israel. You have to engage. Where are you on this?
Funny enough, I think that this Israeli government has often been unwise at over claiming that anti-Semitism is everywhere, and I don't think that's always been wise. And I personally, people would be surprised given to this week's debate. I personally don't think Israel should be closing embassies anywhere, actually. But on the other hand, I also think that since October 7th, a section of the Irish elite, and I don't mean the Irish people at all, but I literally mean top politicians, the media, journalists, academics, writers, have shown a completely unbalanced approach to the Hamas attack on Israel, the ferocious war that has followed in Gaza, and I think that they've indulged in all sorts of, I guess I would call them anti-Semitic tropes, and I think you saw in the reactions of the Irish Prime Minister and the Irish President this week, and actually a pretty unnuanced, in fact, pretty simplistic and wildly hostile approach to what is a very, very complicated conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah. But you do say you think it is a mistake. This is how large your scope is, Simon. We're moving from Ireland to Syria now. Quite a pivot. But we want to talk about your essay. And the only person here sitting quite close to the Syrian border. Obviously, we have hopes that now that Bashar al-Assad is toppled, Syria will become this great democracy, and they'll all sit around watching reruns of Friends. And of course, you have Abu Muhammad al-Jolani doing his rounds, CNN, BBC, trying to present himself as a moderate. Do we have reason to believe that this might, actually succeed? This might be this country that will add to the stability of the Middle East and not to something worse? Not be ISIS
Syria,
too?
Syria is so different from places like Afghanistan because it's always been a multi-sect, multi-ethnic creation. And that is, of course, because it was created by the French in that way. The history of the Syrian Republic is interesting because though one sort of tends to think that Israel was a very kind of recent imperial creation of the imperial powers, that all the other countries in the Middle East are ancient countries that have always existed. Not so. I mean, they're all created by the imperial powers pretty recently, but essentially after World War II. The French looked at many, many different options of what to do with their mandate of Greater Syria, which was basically Syria and today's Lebanon. At one point, they wanted to create about 6 states out of it. 2 Sunni ones, one in Aleppo, one in Damascus, one for the Alawites, which produced the Assad family, of course, one for the Druze, and then a Christian-dominated state in what is now essentially Lebanon, created for the French allies, the Maronites. So, and they tried different options, and in the end, they decided on a big Syria and a small Lebanon. But anyway, but in answer to your question, we really are this really is an amazing moment in the Middle East. We've seen the crumbling, much of it thanks to Israeli military victory, of the Iranian Shia crescent, or whatever one wants to call the Shia Islamic Empire that they built very successfully over the last 20 years using proxies. But we also see the limits of proxy warfare, because if you have proxies, when the proxies get out of control or are too aggressive, there's a limit. In fact, it blows back and hits the metropole, the imperial power behind them, and that's what happened. So Iran and Russia are slightly removed from their successes of the last sort of 10 years, and instead we see 2 military regional powers ascendant, Israel on one side and Turkey on the other, and both of them are fascinating countries because they were both almost created in very similar ways, and there are big parallels between the way they were both created out of rebellions and military action against the British imperial power. They are both highly sophisticated, large and successful societies and economies. They have the most successful militaries in the region. And they were both created in in ethnic strife with huge population movements, and they're both kind of highly nationalistic countries as well, with high religious observance. So they're very similar in many ways, and they are the 2 paramount powers regionally now. And the big question is Turkey. What's Turkey going to do? Turkey has both a Muslim Brotherhood Sunni background that makes it sympathetic to Hamas, for example, hence it's hosting Hamas. But it's also a sort of, I would call it a sort of semi-feral NATO ally. But it also has Ottoman aspirations to its former Ottoman provinces, which of course include Syria. And of course, it's occupying a large section of northern Syria and has been since 2016. You won't hear anything of that in the Western press because it doesn't involve Israel. But it's just an interesting fact that few people have talked about it, and it is now fighting and bombing Kurdish forces. So that's a big question. But the biggest question is, of course, what this character Al-Jilani will do. Is he as skeptics would say, and Israel can never afford in this case to be anything other than a skeptic, because Israel can never afford to take chances on this. But I guess the big question is like the $1 million question in world affairs today is, who is Al-Jilani? Is he an extremely shrewd, well briefed? He speaks beautiful classical Arabic, apparently. He's highly educated. Is he a well-briefed mask for an essentially Islamist jihadist project to take over the Syrian state? Or is he that amazing, remarkable thing, a real nation builder who has put terrorism behind him and who wishes to build a new, tolerant, multi-sect, multi-ethnic Syrian state that is at peace with its neighbors, like Israel, and is not a complete cat's paw either for Turkish Sunni Islamism and neo-Ottoman expansion.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's the big question. So where, you'll have seen this interview he did. He's done lots of them. But he did the BBC this week. And what's your money on? Real or fake?
I would. It would be insane to it's insane for me to even guess at that. I think that there's a real danger at moments like this for people who observe geopolitical matters like me to hold forth on internal Syrian politics, which is incredibly complicated and nuanced. And there are lots of amazing experts on this who've observed him for years. They are all, by the way, they all just say, check and verify, and let's give this a chance. But
we had Richard Haas on the podcast last week who said, "Don't trust, but verify."
Yeah, but actually, don't trust and verify, and trust and verify. The point is just to verify, and this is the Middle East where things can go wrong, and the record of Islamists changing into secular nation builders is not a great one. I can't think of many examples of this happening. But
I mean, you say you wouldn't bet on him, and that I mean there weren't so many people who were guessing that Bashar al-Assad will be toppled in 11 days. Israel is sort of looking at the largest part of this axis of evil, which is Iran, and asking itself, well, perhaps this regime could be toppled. I think that's incredibly optimistic of us, but that is, at the end of the day, an interesting question as well.
Well, I think the thing is, first of all, the Assad regime, it's just fascinating that, Assad was presiding over what is really the most kind of the biggest kind of slaughter machine since the Nazis. And a lot of people who've seen the mass graves and the torture centers, the killing, are now saying that. It really is pretty unprecedented, actually. And it is fascinating for those of us who observe Western discourse that, that there are still people, BBC grandees, United Nations humanitarian reporters and others who were defending Assad 2 weeks ago, online, and that actually virtually no one was calling this out, even though we all knew about it. No supranational humanitarian organization were doing much about this. So this is just, that demonstrates a certain lack of balance at the very least. And that's one point. The second point is, that's what happens to dictatorships. When they fall first slowly and then very fast. Not a phrase I invented. So it's a well-known phenomenon. And that is why, that is the drama of military action, that it can succeed so well. And so with Iran, one has to say that it's very fragile, it's humiliated. That makes it extremely dangerous. There's no tiger as dangerous as a lame tiger, and it is looking pretty lame now. And at some point, that regime will fall. And when it happens, we'll all be astonished and surprised, and it will happen first slowly and then very fast.
I mean, that's an interesting question. Because you look at things historically, whether you look at what's happened to Iran this last 6 months, actually, it's not even the whole of the last year, and think it's a portend of eventual collapse, or is this a blip from which they recover? Because it is all about the sense of time, in a way, and perspective. Right now it looks as if they're on their knees, or hanging by a thread. But you stand back and think maybe they've been there since 1978. They'll get through this.
Well, I think the thing is, it is a fascinating phenomenon when you look at these big totalitarian, authoritarian, repressive states. It's very hard to bring them down from the outside. It was different with Assad because there'd been a sort of punishing civil war from within, and the regime was increasingly hollowed out. In Iran, rather like in Russia, and if you look at states like Russia and Iran, they have colossal security forces within them, and it's very unusual in history for those states to fall due to crowd pressure or popular pressure. They virtually always fall from within. I mean, there are exceptions. The fall of the Shah is one of them. In fact, the fall of Nicholas II is another of them. But if you look at the longer history, these are actually quite exceptional cases. That it has to be you have to reach a stage where the security forces are willing to defect, and that's quite a big ask and doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Especially when you have a regime that's quite willing to shoot people in the streets. I mean, hereditary monarchs like the Shah weren't willing to do that, but these people are. So it's a big ask. I mean, just in terms of history, the rise of the Islamic Republic, its amazing success in the last 20 years, was really marked. And if you look back at Iranian history or Persian history, you had the sort of short and astonishing reign of Nadir Shah in the 18th century when he took Delhi and took the Caucasus and expanded Persian power to its greatest extent in modern times. But really, to see the success that the Islamic Republic achieved in the last 20 years under Khamenei was, you have to go back to the Sasanian Empire of the 7th century, when Khusro II invaded the Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire as it was then, and literally took the whole Middle East, including Jerusalem, including Damascus, and made it all the way to the Bosphorus, and looked like he was about to take Constantinople, and that lasted 20 years. It then ended with the complete collapse of that empire. So there is a parallel for this drama, this roller coaster of suddenly rising to immense regional power and then crashing to complete disaster. And that huge military effort, between sort of 614 and 629 AD, ultimately ended with the complete destruction of the Persian Empire at that time.
Last time we had you on, which was November 23, our main sort of focus for the conversation was what was happening in academia. And I wonder if when you look at, it's been more than a year since, if something has improved?
I mean, I think a lot of things have improved. I mean, when one looks at Israel today, it has displayed astonishing resilience. Its military prowess has changed the complete balance of power in the Middle East, and has more than restored deterrence. It's overturned the complete balance of power there. And again, it's interesting. There was people were so impressed with Iranian Islamic power and how sophisticated and how large the arsenals of Hezbollah and so on were supposed to be. On the other hand, the Israeli democracy is in terrible peril and jeopardy, and Israeli leaders have been indicted, as you know, obviously by the ICC, and one has to look at both these things like Janus, in a two-faced. There's a Jekyll and Hyde situation. In one sense, astonishing military prowess has restored Israel's attractiveness to other Middle Eastern powers like Saudi Arabia, the Saudis are very impressed with what Israel's done. On the other hand, the Gaza war, ferocious war in a unique urban battlescape with a ruthless terrorist group. In one sense, they've clearly, Hamas has clearly been destroyed. On another sense, the cost has been unbearable in Palestinian civilians, and even though the casualty figures are clearly exaggerated by Hamas, and some of them are invented, there have clearly been excesses, probably war crimes during that war, which must be investigated ultimately. So it's impossible to look at what's happened with Israel and Israel's successes and flaws without looking at a Jekyll and Hyde situation, a Janus-like situation, and we recognise that
in the Janus phase, in the sense of military gains on the one hand and a cost to international legitimacy.
I think a cost to international legitimacy, but also perhaps just as grave, a real threat from the Netanyahu government and his extremist ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, a real threat to Israeli democracy, Israeli secular democracy, Israeli liberal democracy, and also, let's face it, these people have also been disastrous, catastrophic, in practical terms. The Israeli army not being on the Gaza border, but being in the West Bank, supporting a settler project that should never be happening, and also in terms of international opinion, the fact that much of it is based, or part of it is based, on the statements of these ministers.
This might be a closing question. Tom Friedman of the New York Times has said that he thinks Netanyahu in the end will be judged not just the worst leader in Israeli history, but one of perhaps the worst leader in Jewish history. Whenever I encounter a historian, I always want to put that question to them, somebody who knows a bit about Jewish history. And the judgment shifts with events. But as of now, if you were making that judgment, is Friedman right, or is that too harsh?
I think it's very hard. When there's a temptation to people like Friedman to compare Netanyahu to characters from Jewish or Judean history, like the two brothers of the Hasmonean and Maccabean dynasty, whose sort of feuding led to the arrival of Pompey the Great and Roman power in Jerusalem, and ultimately brought the downfall of the independent Maccabean kingdom. But I think it's impossible to look at Netanyahu without, as so often in this region and in Israeli history, without having two views which we need to hold at the same time. In one sense, even though the successes that Israel's won in Gaza, in Lebanon, and against Iran, are really the successes of the Israeli security forces and the IDF, and not the Netanyahu government. But nonetheless, he's shown the nerve to approve those operations, So history will give him some credit for that. On the other hand, much of the disaster of October 7th was a result of his policies, and much of the disaster and the failures of the Gaza war are the result of his policies and his ministers. And so ultimately, I think he's the sooner he goes, the better.
I'm glad you got us to Jerusalem, which is, of course, the subject of your new and updated book, and also got us to the Maccabees, because that brings us to the fact that Hanukkah is looming. I'm sure many of our listeners will be already wrapping up their copies of Jerusalem as gifts for the family. So we encourage that. Simon Sebag Montefiore, thanks so much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Always great to talk to him, right? It's always an illuminating conversation. And to have the historical perspective and to think about, to me, particularly the question of Iran, and many Israelis have been asking that question, are they the next to fall? Again, that is very optimistic. But when you get his perspective of the history of this region and what can still happen, I mean, that is fascinating.
Yeah, and as we said throughout, not many people who will have a big sweep of Syrian history, but also can tell you about what happened in Limerick in Ireland in 1904. In his case, it's family history as well. But always, as you say, a pleasure to have Simon Sebag Montefiore on the podcast. We're about to get to our awards, but we should mention some lesser awards, not nearly as well known as our Chuzpah and Mensch accolades. I'm talking about the Academy Awards out of Hollywood. There is a shortlisting for the BB Files, the documentary that we featured on the podcast last week when we spoke to the director, Alexis Bloom. This is a crucial stage in a life of a film before it gets to the big one, which is to be actually nominated for an Oscar. But in the Best Documentary Feature category, it is shortlisted. And one of its rival films is No Other Land, which is a Palestinian-made documentary film. So I don't know whether that means Benjamin Netanyahu will be rooting for the BB Files, because he'll be thinking that's good to get one over on the Palestinian film. I somehow doubt it, because it's not exactly great for him.
No, but we should say that since we had Alexis Bloom on last week, it's good karma for you to come on Unholy. That's the main takeaway I'm bringing forth from this conversation. Let's go to our actual awards this week, and we'll start with the Mensch. I think this week could only go to one person, one woman, a French woman, Gisèle Pellicot, really a hero of the women's rights movement and the feminist movement, and I should just say a general hero of humanity. She's the center of a massive rape case. Her husband drugged and raped her, invited men to rape her while she was unconscious. She decided, she waived her right to anonymity. The trial was conducted in front of the whole world to see, and today the verdicts came out. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Alongside him, 50 other men, all of them found guilty. This is a huge victory for her, and just to think of how difficult this was, to stand in front of the world, to say what happened to her. I mean, it is something, she's beyond courageous, and I can't think of anyone else who deserves this award this week more than her.
I agree, wholly deserving. And what she said was that the shame had to be shifted off the victim and onto the perpetrator, and some 50 others found guilty. And it has absolutely triggered a huge discussion in France, but I would say around the world. So I agree with you. That's a very, very worthy winner. For Chuzpah, I think I'm not sure how well known this name will be, but I think the Chuzpah nominee has to be a former lieutenant in the Assad regime's Air Force Intelligence Directorate, Salama Mohammed Salama. Now you'll be thinking, well, who's that? And what could he possibly have done? CNN sent a camera crew into Syria. They were there reporting when they felt that they busted into a jail, and they're posing as a victim of the Assad regime, saying that, as if sort of trembling at being freed, was a man who identified himself as Adel Hurbal from the central Syrian city of Homs. Obviously got the viewers' sympathy, but some viewers in Syria saw this man and thought, he looks rather familiar. And sure enough, it turns out that he was a lieutenant in the Assad regime's Air Force Intelligence Directorate, Salama Mohammed Salama. So he was posing, again, a perpetrator, posing as a victim. Just so outrageous chutzpah on his part to do that. And people spotted that, for example, his fingernails were very sort of clean and he was quite well nourished. And, these reports out of these Sednaya and other dungeons and prisons mean that people there are starved and beaten. And that was, in a way, a giveaway. It's a sort of a portent, actually, of one of the processes that will now have to happen in Syria, where, the de-Assadification, as you have to find all the people who were involved. They will try and melt into the population. It happened in other cases. We know even in the last war that there were Germans who fled pretending to be inmates of concentration camps where they had actually been the officers and the guards. So Salama, Mohammed Salama, unmasked.
Martha Gellhorn about that, by the way. It's called No One is a Nazi. No one ever was. We're going to see a lot of those, for sure. Definitely worthy of a Chutzpah award. We're winding up our conversation. We should say that for our Patreon subscribers, there's already a bonus Q&A episode up and running. And next week on Tuesday, our special Unholy Does Christmas bonus episode.
You are going to want to hear that, I think, because it's all there. We're talking Chinese food. We're talking whether you have the tree, why people go to the cinema, how come Jews... it's a whole lot of Chrismukkah fun of Christmas and Hanukkah coming together. I do admit some of the sort of journey I've been on when it comes to this season. So I think people might like that. The simplest way to get to hear it is to subscribe, and you can do that. There's all kinds of different ways of doing it, whether as a friend of the podcast, whether you are a family member of the podcast. I ran into someone yesterday who said, can you be part of the Unholy Alliance? They thought that would be a new tier. It's all there. You just go to patreon.com/unholypodcast and you can unlock that episode, just that one episode if you want it, but also become a friend or family member of our podcast. And I think...
Right. And we should also say that we'll be publishing a form today, Thursday, for early registration to order a tote bag for anyone who joins Patreon. And a reminder that those who join as family members get the bag for no extra cost. I'm not a family member, by the way. I registered as a friend of the pod.
Yeah.
I'm considering, is there a tier that is frenemy of the pod? If so... but yeah, one of the two co-hosts is actually registered as well. I'm revealing some secrets.
You are. I felt quite guilty when I saw that you were a friend of the podcast. I thought it's like being a friend of myself. It would just be a bit weird. But maybe, if people are thinking about Hanukkah gifts for me or for anybody in your own family who would like to be initiated into our Unholy Alliance, you can do that as a Hanukkah gift or a Christmas gift if that's your leaning. You can do all of it. Patreon.com/unholypodcast. I think we have some thank yous, don't we?
Our thank yous to Michal Porat and Gili Remen, and we shall meet next week.